This is the fourth and final talk, concluding talk in the series on the Gospel according to Exodus. In the previous talk, I introduced the whole idea of a dramatic plot structure, and I introduced the five dramatic terms that Kenneth Burke used. That talk was more a big picture talk, and we looked at the implications of using the genre of drama to describe the actions of God, and how that is a paradigm shift away from the idea of a totally omnipotent God who does not work in a drama, who just works by decree, ex cathedra. And I made the point that most of our conceptions of God are out of that omnipotent class of actions. God can do whatever he wants. The whole framework of a drama inverts that and introduces the idea of motive, energy within constraints in a contested space. And the amazing thing about viewing the Bible as drama, and I think it presents itself as a drama, is God is dipping down to play inside that contested drama, that contested space. We talked about that in the last talk. It's a very, very rich way to think. I won't say more of it now, but what I want to do in this final one is to wrap it up by bringing the idea of redemption back into our world and seeing how this Exodus story would stretch, reframe, reposition our whole thinking around the right arm of God, the power of God intervening in human history to save human beings. Now, I'm going to use a schematic that's really useful in this generational activity that we've talked about. It's a matrix. A matrix looks like a spreadsheet, except that a spreadsheet, which has rows and columns and then cells, a spreadsheet is just numerical. It's merely a calculative algorithm. A conceptual matrix is different. You've got across the top, you've got your columns, and down the left, you've got your rows, but you've got conceptual categories. And the puzzle is when I come to a cell, how they interact with each other and how they generate ideas that are, as it were, the conceptual new territory in answer to the puzzle produced by the matrix. By the way, the word matrix, the Greek word from which it comes, means womb. So the idea of a matrix as a generative space is etymologically correct. The matrix I'm going to use, you can draw it yourself, and it's by no means a finished work. That's why I want to share the structure of the schematic with you, so you can work on it yourself, because I continue to do that in my own mind. Has columns across the top. Now, the first column is where we are now, which would, let's call it the traditional forensic model of salvation, of which penal substitution is the apex. The second column is Exodus and salvation in the Exodus story and how that stretches that. The third column is the so what. So what would that say about a reparadigmed, stretch paradigmed view of redemption in the new covenant? Now, down the left-hand side, you could put anything you wanted to down the left-hand side, but I'm going to use the dramatic terms. How does this idea of story, redemption as a story, how does that work if I use Burke's 5 terms for each of the rows? So I'll go through them and introduce the thinking to you and work with it yourself. So the first one would be the actors. So in the traditional forensic model, the actors are very much God as the judge and humanity as the guilty party. And Christ is the mediator as the sacrifice between those two. So the dramatis personae is very much an antagonistic one that presumes a fundamental antagonism between God and humanity, a fundamental contest. Very unfortunately, I actually think, not just incorrectly, but probably blasphemously, this says that our gospel message should declare to people that they are born enemies of God. They are born hostile to God, and that's the position from which they begin. So that's actually the judicial setup of the actors at play. There is a second, possibly less important, but nonetheless also implied in the judicial metaphor, is the idea that it's a very individual one-on-one thing. It's every individual human being versus God, as it were. So that's I think, the traditional assumptions behind the actors in the judicial model. When we move to Exodus, we see none of that applies. Exodus is not a judicial contest. The concept of God as judge against humanity, against his people, is simply absent. Instead, the contest is God versus Pharaoh. That's the antagonism that is taking place, or the contest that is taking place in Exodus. And it is an absolute to-the-death arm wrestle between Pharaoh and his forces, the array of his forces, and God. And God's agent is Moses. And they're outnumbered because God is going to work, but his power will be channeled through Moses and Aaron. Whereas Pharaoh has on his side all the vast array of the biggest empire on the earth, all the magicians, all the resources. And so that completely changes the game. That we're looking here at a rivalry between God and Pharaoh. Now, Israel, in the Exodus story, Israel is characterised not as the villain of the piece, not as enemies, but as the object of the contest. They're the ones to be won or lost. It is, in fact, a battle of ownership. So Israel is not presented as quote unquote guilty or sinful. I think they're acknowledged to be stupid. They're acknowledged to be whingers. There's no way they are lionised in the story. It's accepted that they're an unworthy people, but that's not part of the dynamic of the story. Clearly, if you go back to the judicial model, what's missing in the judicial model is any intrinsic role for Satan. He's Satan, the forces of darkness, the accuser of the brethren. He is not intrinsic to the judicial model. So, what does that then say if we took that through to salvation, to our concept of salvation? Well, I think it invites us to see humanity is the object over which there is a huge struggle. And the struggle is a struggle of ownership between God and his enemies, the principalities and powers in the heavenly places. That is the antagonism. That is the battle. And it is a battle to the death. It is a battle with no holds barred. But that's the contest. If we were to ask ourselves where we see that in the New Testament, it's pretty easy to find it. I mean, Paul clearly has the battle with principalities and powers front and centre in his thinking of the gospel. And the Pharaoh model, if we transfer the Pharaoh model into our situation, you can say this cosmos is like an Egypt. It's a land in bondage with a governor. And the problematic situation is, that we have is not that we're guilty, but that we're in bondage. We're in slavery. So a real shift in emphasis on that first axis of who are the actors in the story. Let's go to the second one, which is what about the critical actions? Now, every drama's got a plot structure. The plot structure is not just incidental activities, it's actions that are furthering the resolution of the problem. So what's the plot structure? Well, in the traditional model of the forensic model, the action is a judicial transaction. It's a judicial transaction of accusation and forgiveness. But as that translates into the gospel, what happens is it positions the cross as the engine for salvation. And what that does in turn is it sidelines the resurrection. So the resurrection is not intrinsic to the mechanism of salvation. The mechanism of salvation by which the great activity occurs is the cross, that is the sacrifice, and the resurrection is a expedited journey, trajectory out of that by the divine Son of God. It's not intrinsic to the salvation journey. This has led to a real issue with, I think, the Reformed soteriology, which is, well, that doesn't sound too good. I mean, the resurrection should conceptually, logically be part of the engine of salvation. The problem doesn't stop there. We also, if we went upstream into the antecedent activities, which in this case will be the Gospels, the whole life of Jesus, the 3-year ministry of Jesus, seems to be a prelude to the cross, but not intrinsically connected. And to the extent you could almost say, well, why was that 3 years of ministry even necessary? I mean, if the cross was what happened. So the monopolization of the redemptive structure by the cross is problematic. It's problematic, I think, within Reformed theology. I think it also positions this judicial action as a transaction, something that is the removal of guilt. That's about it. Big as that is, that's not a complete picture. So the action or the plot structure of redemption is the judicial mechanism of the cross. Go to Exodus and straight away we see this is completely different. What we see in Exodus, let's go back to the issue. The issue is releasing God's people from bondage into a new kingdom where he will be the ruler. It's a very, very rich goal. Now, there's not one event in Exodus that achieves that. There is a series of critical plot structures that achieve that, and they accumulate. It's like they gather in momentum. So it begins, the redemptive activity clearly begins with the birth of Moses, who's going to be the agent for it. It continues with his passage into the court of Pharaoh, because if you think about it, the ease with which he could converse with Pharaoh would have been impossible if he was just a slave. He was a pseudo-prince. He was educated in the ways of Egypt. He could talk the talk. I think we often don't recognise that. So his passage into the court of Pharaoh. Then in the life of Moses, another critical part of the redemption is the burning bush revelation of God, where he sees I am that I am. And that epic chapter is not a coincidental event. It is critical to the whole redemptive journey, because this is going to be a journey towards a personal relationship and a God we know and can call by name. So this revelation of the transcendence and the presence of God and the person of God is vital to the journey. So that's the burning bush. And then the succession of events, including the plagues, including the pre-plague of snake versus snake. So the plagues are a contest. They're a contest of powers between the magicians of Pharaoh and God's superior power. And it's a contest, the plagues are a contest that are taking place in the natural realm, because you see, Pharaoh was positioned as a god, and all of the ancient Near Eastern kings were positioned as gods. They were the only ones who were, but the one who was most positioned as a god was the Pharaoh. And there was a pretty simple reason for that people could look to the king, to the Pharaoh, as a god. They were looking to the god for certainty. The good part about Pharaoh is he had the Nile, so the whole of their agriculture, the whole of their economy, the whole of their social cycle was very secure. So that allowed Pharaoh to position himself very firmly as a god who could be authorizing blessing. And it was that was attacked by the plagues. Your sense that you own creation is attacked by the plagues. So that's the battle. The battle over the plagues is clearly the beginning of this. Cosmic is the word that George Athas uses in a wonderful article on it. It's a cosmic struggle between Yahweh through his agent Moses and Pharaoh. Part of that cosmic struggle are debates, because the background is that Moses approaches Pharaoh and asks and debates and challenges. So there's a battle of minds going on as well between really two worldviews, a worldview that's monotheistic, a worldview that's beginning to be the great revelation of the God who controls all of nature, with a pagan polytheistic worldview. That's part of it. Then the debate, then the struggle climaxes, it begins to climax with the blood on the doorposts, which became the Passover feast. Now, obviously, that's the typology of the cross, but you can see from what I've just said, that's actually it's fitting into a sequence. It's not the only plot structure. Things are built up to that, but they're not finished with that. The salvation is not finished with that. What then happens is the Exodus, the movement out, and the final victory. Now, the final victory is at the Red, or I think it's the Reed Sea, where Pharaoh, having said, yes, they can go, is then consumed by this maniacal, obsessive, proprietary greed. I see it, frankly, in Putin, and I see it in other dictators who have this enormous sense of ownership that drives them. And it's maniacal. It's not logical. It won't get balanced, and he is sucked in by that, and he pursues. He reneges on his promise, pursues the children of Egypt. Now they go through God parts the waters, and they go through on dry land, and they're on the other side. The armies see opportunity. This is it. This is our opportunity to absolutely crush our enemies. And that sense of opportunity is what is their undoing, because it sucks them in. God allows then the waters to take back again, and they, in some kind of tsunami, overwhelm Pharaoh's forces, and they hit quicksand, they hit water, they drown, and the seas drown Pharaoh's armies. As we talked about in a previous talk, the sea is in the Old Testament an image of chaos. And so what we're seeing happening at this final event is chaos, as in the forces of Pharaoh, is consumed by chaos, the waters. And the whole point of that battle is, as Moses says, or I think the Lord says to Moses, the enemies you see today, you will see no more. I'm not just going to get you out. I'm going to obliterate your enemies and you'll be absolutely home free, absolutely home free. So the redemptive sweep in Exodus it's captured in Leviticus 23, where they have feasts to commemorate aspects of their journey, and the feasts are year long, and those feasts are emblems of salvation. So salvation is not seen as a singular event, as in the judicial model, but a whole sweep. Well, what does that say about how we might view salvation, how we might view redemption? I think it's very powerful. And particularly if we say, okay, the goal, let's keep the goal in mind. The goal of redemption is to restore, regain God's cosmic rule of the cosmos through human beings. That's the goal. And he's wanting to create a kingdom. So I think this invites us to now see a sweep of redemptive. We now see Jesus as Moses. So we see Moses as a type of Jesus, and we can now begin to see a sweep of types of events that typify the redemptive activity of God in and through Christ. Begins with the incarnation. Begins with the birth of Jesus. I think the incarnation is better seen throughout all of history, but I won't get onto that now. I think that we then see in the life of Jesus, we see contest. We see, particularly now that we've got the actors being God versus the principalities and powers. So we see contest. Now the contest begins with a temptation in the wilderness. And that temptation in the wilderness over the last year or two has loomed large in my mind. It goes back to the talks I gave on the Grand Inquisitor. They are the corollary of Genesis 3. They are the second Adam debating with Satan. So that temptation sets the scene of an arm wrestle. We then go through in the Gospels. We see the miracles not as coincidental, not as arbitrary, not as reactive, but they are signs of rule, exactly like Moses's were over creation, ruling the raging of the sea, ruling sickness, ruling death. They are harbingers of the rule of God that Jesus will be bringing in. They don't accomplish it, but they're forerunners. We go further and we start to see the debates with the Pharisees, because the Gospels are framed by miracles and debates. Just as we saw a debate between Moses and Pharaoh, debates over who runs the show, who runs the earth, and how the earth will be run. We then sweep into the cross, which is obviously critical, caught in the Passover, and the sacrifice is now seen differently, I think, in a way that unifies cross and resurrection. They are two sides of the one coin, because what we see here is the death of death, and that imagery of the forces of chaos, the killing forces, the murderous forces, getting sucked in to kill the author of life, and in so doing killing themselves and being destroyed. So those forces of chaos, it's no longer Pharaoh, but it is Rome. It is Pontius Pilate in a terrible alliance with the Sanhedrin. And they are killing out of jealousy. They're killing out of envy and jealousy their enemy with a view to control him. Behind Pilate, behind the Sanhedrin, were the powers of darkness who are murderers from the beginning. They get sucked into the grave, and in the great patristic vision, to defeat death. It's not that Jesus went through death, he defeated death. Death ate death. So the imagery of Exodus starts to give us a imagery with resurrection intrinsic to the whole thing, because it's all part of the one cycle, and the cross is just one side going in, the resurrection is the other side going out. It's like looking at a ball or something, you will look at one side, look at the other side, look at the same ball. And what's happening is a new creation, a new order being inaugurated. So the plot structure of redemption, if we take the lesson of Exodus, just gets much, 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 much richer. And it certainly begins to give us an integrated view of redemption, that the whole of the ministry of Jesus, the whole of his life and his teaching, his death and his resurrection, this is the full sweep of God's salvation at work, God's great work going on. So that's probably the big one, as a plot structure. The powers that were at work, the agencies that were at work. Let's go to that one. Whenever somebody does something in a drama, they've got to use, because it's contested space, we've got to use some kind of resources to get somewhere. And they could be cognitive, they could be our mind, it could be a battle of wits. If it's a military victory, yes, for sure, it'll be a battle of forces. But they're often central to the drama. The Lord of the Rings is about, who's got the power of the rings, who can access it. And one of the most powerful motifs in drama is when the little guy beats the big guy, because there appears to be an imbalance of resources, but in good drama they're turned on its head, which is what we see here. Now, the judicial model is not like that. The judicial model is a one-way street. The power is the power of a judge, it's the power of authority, it's the power that cannot be gainsaid. And it's ameliorated by the sacrifice of Jesus, but all the agency and power is on one side. If we go to the book of Exodus, clearly something changes again vastly. And in this particular case, let's say that there's cosmic energies unleashed behind the scenes. Behind Pharaoh, behind Moses, there are cosmic powers unleashed. And these cosmic powers are hostile to each other. But they are not, they are behind human activity. They're not separated from human activity. They're energizing it. They're powering it. And that is the battle. It's a battle of these energies. The interesting thing also in Exodus, which I find interesting, is it's also a military struggle. So you've got Pharaoh's vast armies and resources. They are defeated. So the final collapse, yes, can be seen as a military defeat, except it's not army versus army. Moses has no army. Moses has no swords. Moses is told to stand still and watch. What does he see? The battle becomes a battle of military forces versus creational forces. The sea, the forces of nature, they eat up the military. And that in itself is, to me, also evocative, because I see the resurrection as a creational energy unleashed, an energy of physics, new physics, creational physics, God's physics, that eats up the laws of matter that are bound by sin and death. So, and the other thing that is very much at play throughout Exodus is the lonely hero, Moses, with apparently no resources at all, apparently none, versus the huge wealth of Pharaoh, replete with wealth, resources, mighty armies. It looks like a completely unbalanced, unequal struggle. But the little guy beats the big guy. So if we move that into salvation and say, what does this do in salvation? I think our view of salvation, our view of the cross, is we are really, more and more, I think we are asked, invited to see the cross and resurrection as a exercise of enormous creational forces, as enormous as the forces that formed the world. I think Paul alludes to this in his mighty prayer in Ephesians chapter 1, when he prays that the church would grasp the exceeding greatness, excessive greatness of his energies, his powers toward us who believe, which are the same as the energies he unleashed when he raised Jesus from the dead. So in my mind, more and more, I think of resurrection not in forensic terms, but I think and salvation in forensic terms, as in vast tectonic plates of the cosmic infrastructure moving and a new creation being formed. Of course, as well as that, we very much see the inversion of power, because when Jesus came to the earth, this vastness was going to be released through someone who had nothing going for him at the human level. Born wrong side of the tracks in Galilee, poor parents, mere carpenter, not having armies, not having wealth, not having social position, not having education that we know of through a Pharisaical school, none of those things. And yet without apparent resources, turning the world upside down. So that's the powers at play, the third of the dramatic elements in this view of salvation as a drama. Fourth one is the scene. Every drama takes place in a context. That's very important. Great writers paint a picture of a scene. I think Thomas Hardy's novels are very often set in vast, windswept, barren landscapes. He spends pages describing them. Why? Well, that gets a sense of human beings being pawns in a vast game of fate that we cannot withstand. He's really he's evoking Greek tragedy. And Tess of the D'Urbervilles just feels like a victim to vast forces of fate. That's how a scene affects things. Other scenes could be kind of claustrophobic. Some famous plays happen just inside one space and they don't move outside that space. So what are the scenes at play? Well, clearly the judicial context is a courtroom. That's the scene. It's a moral value-based scene, and it alludes to the fact that within the courtroom there's a code. So they're all the elements at play. Let's go to Exodus. What's the scene in Exodus? Well, clearly it is not a courtroom. It is not a courtroom. It's not a confined thing. It is a geopolitical space. It is a space of ruling a territory that's, I think, a microcosm of the whole earth. And the scene is not just a geographical scene. I said it's a geopolitical scene. That means there are laws at play. The Israelites were living under bondage of onerous systems, onerous laws that they clearly couldn't get out of. And the scene, the political part of the scene, is very much framed by the issue of ownership. Pharaoh thinks he owns them. They're his slave class. And we know that great Christians, particularly led by Gregory of Nyssa, when he attacked slavery, he was the first person in civilization to root and branch condemn slavery in 360, 380 AD. His argument was ownership. How can one human being say they own another human being? And it's really what's going on in Egypt. Pharaoh thinks he owns the people. So it is a totalitarian ownership system. That's the scene that is set. Well, let's go and say, how does that, if we transfer that to our picture of salvation, what does it say? Clearly, I know, I'm not saying the judicial wouldn't apply, but it's a subset of a cosmic geography. There is a cosmic scale battle going on where ownership is the critical issue. Who owns the world and who governs the show? I think the systems of oppression that bind up the Israelites, the corollary of that in Romans 8 is the law of sin and death. We are bound up, we're entrammelled, we're cobwebbed in a law of sin and death. And just as the Israelites couldn't get out of that system, neither can we, try as we will. So from bondage and slavery to freedom and citizenship is how this reframes the gospel. Okay, well that's the four big ones, and we finish with the purpose one, which is every drama has got a purpose. It's going somewhere. Every drama is moving towards something, and that purpose is sometimes implicit, sometimes explicit, but the values of the writer will be clear in the purpose. In the judicial system, the judicial model, the purpose is forgiveness. That's the purpose. There's a problem with that, which I've often critiqued, which is this is a minimalist outcome. This is merely the getting rid of guilt. In fact, it could be argued it's purposeless. The reason it is because in the forgiveness model, forgiveness is only necessary when there's a sin. So that is allowing sin to define forgiveness and therefore define the purpose. So God is reduced to a reactionary agent. And if there were no sin, there would be no need for salvation. So this is the limitations of the gospel beginning in Genesis 3. When we go to Exodus and we say, well, what seems to be the purpose, the telos, the movement, it's clearly something vastly bigger than quote unquote forgiveness. There is no hint of a judicial transaction or transition in Exodus. What there is a vision, and the vision is Canaan. Now, Canaan isn't just a land. The critical concept there is sonship. In Exodus 4, when Moses is debating with Pharaoh and opens up the claim, he says, the let my people go claim. What he says is, because Israel is my son, my firstborn son, let them go that they may serve me. Now, the firstborn son is a critical phrase, and it's pursued obviously through the plague of the blood on the doorpost, because this means inheritance. In the ancient Near Eastern world, that's code for the future prince. Now, that is establishing the movement and trajectory. God wants inheritance. He wants his people to be kings and queens of Canaan and mediate his presence into Canaan. So there is a enormous vision of potentiality of God's people. It's not just God's purposes would not be achieved by, for instance, Pharaoh merely, okay, give up. They can no longer be slaves. They can be free citizens. Well, there were no such things, but they can have equal rights to all the Egyptians and so on and so forth in Egypt. That would not have fulfilled it. That would not have fulfilled the purpose. God wanted to pluck them totally out of that system into a totally new system, blank sheet of paper, start a new society, a theocracy of God on the earth. The reason that Exodus can have that forward-looking vision and trajectory is because it goes back to Genesis and picks up the whole idea that humanity is made in God's image. It's important to bear in mind that Moses, or the school of Moses, was the author of Genesis. The story of Genesis 1 was a story framed by Moses. It wasn't just written by someone long before Moses. He wrote it. And so the Exodus purpose is stretched backwards and forwards, and the beginning of all things and the end of all things. If we were to then say, what does this do as to how we frame salvation, then clearly the purpose of salvation has to be grander than just the forgiveness of sins. It has to be, in fact, glory. It has to be sonship and inheritance. God having his people as kings and queens of his cosmos in his land. It is and to articulate that in our day and age, we've got to go back to Genesis, just as Moses did, and articulate the corollary of that, which is, and all humanity is born with this potential for all. It's not as if the rule of the cosmos, it's not as if that is some alien faculty which we will get in the future and we have zero of it now. It's more of a transition from, we were created with that potential. It's not actualized, but we're created with it. And God's will is to actualize it. Now, that, I think, is where the gospel needs to begin. It needs to be framed by that purpose, and we have to begin to read the New Testament and see how vital this concept of inheritance and sonship was to the writers of the New Testament. I think particularly of Hebrews chapter 1 and Romans chapter 8. Hebrews chapter 1 is a fantastic chapter where it begins, God, who at various times and different manner in the past spoke to us by his prophets, has in these last days spoken unto us by his Son. Now, does he go on and say who died for our sins? No, he mentions that later, but it's not front and centre. Whom he has appointed heir of all things, through whom he made the cosmos. Full stop. Bang! Wow. You see what he's done? He went forward, he went back. Forward, he's appointed him as the heir of all things. Clearly, we are co-heirs with him, Romans 8 says. He goes back, through whom he made the cosmos. That is how we must frame the gospel. And our faith and our grasp of the redemptive effort needs to be lengthened both ways, beginning and end. So that's, I think, a very exciting way to think of the gospel, to let Exodus frame how we think of the gospel. As I said at the beginning of these 4 talks, this is hardly, seeing Exodus as a topology of the whole of the redemptive action of God is hardly a tenuous claim. It's a claim that's clearly biblical, and in fact not just biblical incidentally, but biblical centrally. Both the writers of the New Testament and particularly the prophets of the Old Testament did that. And this final talk is, I think these 5 dramatic elements are very, very evocative, and I don't think I've covered them exhaustively by any stretch of the imagination. And I hope my goal is it gives us all, the Exodus story gives us all a powerful enough new centre of gravity to begin to rethink salvation away from the narrow strictures and distortions of the penal and judicial model.